What's up, everybody? So, I wanted to get a video out to you about something that I was looking into that I thought was worth having discussion on. Now, lately, a lot of people tend to use new peptides called GLP-1s, glucagon-like peptides, like Ozempic, Wegovy, or Mounjaro, I believe is one of the brand names of another one. Now, these are also ones that might be commonly known as Ozempic, semaglutide, Tirzepatide, retatrutide, and other compounds like that. So one thing that people have been talking about is raised elevated heart rate on these GLP-1s and if it's concerning or not. And I have some thoughts that I want to share myself, and it's something that I want to look into and get to the bottom of and see how I can help mitigate those problems. It's become something that enhanced athletes and bodybuilders have started to use for kind of helping them diet, for appetite control and fat loss. And then you got multifaceted GLP-1s that have GIP and glucagon, like retatrutide, three-way peptides that are being used that are doing just more than one thing. I think it's worth discussing if it's something that we should be worried about or not, and what we can do about it if we do see the elevated heart rate. So we'll get into that here in just one moment. All right. So, what kind of got me thinking about this was actually a quick Instagram reel that I saw from famous bodybuilder Ben Pakulski from that used to compete, was an Olympian. I think he's a fantastic bodybuilder, one of the best Canadian bodybuilders to come out of the North, and had one hell of a set of legs and has an interesting way of training. And I think he's always carried quite a bit of merit and is worth taking consideration some of the things that he comes out with. He's definitely a bright person and I think has a lot to offer in the bodybuilding world when it comes to education and knowledge. So I'll just quickly show his reel, so you can see what got my gears turning here.
Ozempic, Tirzepatide, retatrutide, these GLP-1 agonists have become massive around the world right now. Here's the number one reason why you should not be using these drugs. It's been shown in research and in practice that these medications or drugs are bumping up resting heart rates between 10 and 25% for people. Now, if you're someone who's already metabolically challenged, or maybe you're metabolically dysfunctional, bumping up your resting heart rate by 25% could be an absolute recipe for disaster. I strongly suggest you ask your doctor how you can mitigate the negative side effects of Ozempic, Tirzepatide, retatrutide, these GLP-1 agonists. This is a really big problem, especially if you're someone who's already a candidate for a heart attack to begin with. While getting the weight off is absolutely imperative, if you're not able to exercise, maybe taking the GLP-1 can make sense. But gentlemen, ladies, if you can exercise, you got to commit to 60 minutes a day as soon as you wake up to exercise to get that resting heart rate down first, so that you're even seeing a 20 to 25% bump in the resting heart rate. That seems inevitable with most people taking these GLP-1s, is not going to put you in the 80s into the hundreds, which ultimately I think is going to put you at a greater risk. So while I'm not advocating, and I'm certainly not a doctor, I encourage you to ask your doctor, ask your endocrinologist about these things, because so many people are mindlessly taking these drugs and not aware of the fact that people's resting heart rate is skyrocketing, which is eradicating deep sleep, waking you up feeling tired, and ultimately, as soon as you stop taking these medications, people's body weight skyrockets. Dr. Benjamin Bicklin says people are actually losing muscle, gaining fat on these things because you're just not eating. You got to commit to making sure I'm getting my protein in, I'm training every day, I'm getting my exercise.
So, first off, I agree with what Ben's saying here on understanding the risk of using GLP-1s and how they do elevate your heart rate. I think it's something worth paying attention to for sure. Just like any compound or drug we use, there's risks involved, and we want to understand them before we use them for sure. So I'm going to pull up some of my notes and just kind of share some of my thoughts. But one thing I do disagree with, even though he is correct, is that losing muscle mass on these are not rare. It does happen, but the reason it happens is an easy fix. It's the fact that people get the appetite suppression from these GLP-1s, which is what we're looking for in the drug, but they're not eating their protein. They're not keeping up with their nutrition requirements, and that's causing them to lose muscle mass. So when you go into a caloric deficit, no nutrients present like macronutrients and protein, you're going to have risk of losing muscle mass quite easily. Now, you couple that with having no appetite whatsoever. And protein sometimes for some people can be the toughest thing to actually eat. Carbs are easy, fats are easy to put down, and they're so abundant and cheap. Getting quality protein can be tough. So I can understand that. But for bodybuilders, we understand the need for protein to keep our muscle, to maintain our muscle, as well as to build more muscle after that. But I do agree part that I've seen elevated heart rate. I've seen it with myself using and experimenting with these, and I've seen it with some coaching clients as well as friends that have used them as well. But so let's just get into a little bit of why this happens with GLP-1s, what's concerning when you're monitoring your heart rate and what's not, and how we can relook at this and see if we can make some changes to help ourselves quite a bit. So one thing, so let's just get into the raised heart rate. All right. So let's start off with why GLP-1s tend to have this issue with elevated heart rate. Now, what happens is these GLP-1 agonists, they affect the brain in a couple different ways when it's tied to your appetite, your metabolism, but also your nervous system. So these nervous systems, they increase your sympathetic tone, which is the fight or flight side of your brain. So you can quite easily become put into a state of fight or flight where you're really not in a rest and recovery mode. So your more activity's gone up, heart rate's gone up, and you find yourself in a position where you're not really recovering. You're just always on edge, which gives you an elevated heart rate as well. Now, also, or some of these multi-pathway compounds or multi-faceted GLP-1s that are not just GLP-1s, like I believe semaglutide is just a one-way GLP where it just affects your appetite through the GLP-1 agonist effect. But there's ones like retatrutide and Tirzepatide that have GIP effects as well as glucagon effects as well. And there's a new one, I think, CagriSema, which I haven't really had much experience with. But those also increase with the glucagon, those also increase your resting metabolic rate. So with a raised metabolic rate, you tend to have a raised heart rate because your metabolic process is increased. So that also increases your heart rate as well. Now, let's just quickly give you an idea of metabolic rate. So it's worth noting, what is metabolic rate? So your basal metabolic rate, also known as your BMR, which you've probably seen referred to many of times, that's the number of calories that your body is burning to just do its simple processes to stay alive. So that's pumping blood to the heart, that's you just sitting and breathing, that's digestion in play from the food that you've eaten. This is the repair from any kind of injury that you might have had, your immune system fighting off some sort of infection or sickness. Basically, the energy it takes for you to stay alive, even if you're just laying in bed and doing nothing. That's your BMR. Now, when you increase your BMR through the glucagon effect of these GLP-1 agonists like retatrutide, you're burning more calories to do these processes. So that's also raising your heart rate. So elevated heart rate leads to a higher BMR. Or the other way around, having a higher BMR leads to a higher heart rate. So just by the increased metabolism, you're increasing your heart rate. So it's worth noting kind of what BMR is at that aspect. Now, when we look at increased heart rate, let's say somebody's at a 65 beats per minute heart rate as their baseline heart rate. When should we become concerned? Is that 1 or 2 beats per minute, or is that 100 beats per minute, which is exaggerated, but that would be a very high increase of your beats per minute for your heart rate, your resting heart rate. Now, I'd say maybe 5 BPM or 5 to 10 is something that you would expect from this. You can probably look to say that this is going to happen when I use and implement these GLP-1s. 10 to 15 beats per minute is probably worth monitoring and kind of keeping in line and seeing where that brings you to. If that brought you from 50 to 65, I wouldn't be quite concerned. But if that brought you from, say, your baseline heart rate was at 70 and brought you to 85, or you were at 85 and that brought you to 100, I would be concerned at that point. Now, 15 plus beats per minute is a point where I would suggest to people that, especially if that's a sustained heart rate over time, then that's an issue. That's something that you're going to want to pay attention to. So that's when I would become concerned. Now, what else can we look at to make sure that when we're using GLP-1s that we're not contributing to even more of a higher heart rate? I think it's worth looking in the bodybuilder sense, the stack that you're already on. So that just means the supplements, the PEDs that you're using, and looking at those things as a whole and adding in that GLP-1 and say, how does everything affect my heart rate as a whole? Maybe I'm picking up a little bit of elevated heart rate by increased metabolism from the GLP-1. And then you also maybe in a contest prep setting, you're raising your heart rate from stimulants like clenbuterol, yohimbine, people doing an ephedra stack like an ECY, ECA stack. Those things can increase your heart rate just by stimulatory effect anyhow. Then you can also look in things that are used as a bodybuilder that directly increase your metabolic rate, your metabolism, which would be like your thyroid function. So some bodybuilders utilize T3, which would increase your metabolism, which would increase heart rate, which combined with these GLP-1s even further increase your heart rate. So that's something to consider as well. Then there's some steroids that are probably worth paying attention to that keep you in an elevated fight or flight state anyhow, which kind of get you on edge, give you an elevated heart rate where you're not in a rest and recovery all the time. Stuff like trenbolone would be one to pay attention to. If you're running tren, a lot of guys note feeling never really in a rest state. They're very commonly on tren in feeling like fight or flight mode, always on edge, ready to go. Stuff like Halo that's used at the tail end of a prep. And then you combine these with these stimulants like clenbuterol and yohimbine that elevate your heart rate, caffeine and ephedrine. All these things together just stack upon each other, raising your heart rate even more. I would be concerned and just pay attention saying, how does using these GLP-1s combined with these fat burners, combined with the steroids, combined with what kind of rest I'm having or not having, good sleep I'm having or not having, how does that all affect my heart rate? Because these things over time it might not be a big deal for a few days or a week or two, but elevated heart rate over time gives stress to the heart, making it work harder than it needs to, causing cardiovascular issue. And we know that as bodybuilders, cardiovascular events are the leading cause of death and issue. The biggest thing that you would be concerned with as a bodybuilder, especially as you become a bigger bodybuilder. You have more blood that needs to get pumped. You have more muscle that needs to be circulated with blood, making your heart work harder, making each beat a little bit rougher and tougher for your body to sustain. So that stimulant aspect is something I would pay attention to, which also, again, in my notes, blood pressure. Some of these things elevate your blood pressure, elevate water retention, which can make it each beat worth a little bit harder work, if that makes any sense. And those things can elevate your heart rate, which increase your blood pressure and give you a snowball effect where you're not resting and recovering very easy. Those become recovery issues, which just start to compound and snowball into this bigger cardiovascular risk and stress on the heart. So let's get into a few pointers that I'm aware of. And I'll be honest, I don't have all the answers to yet of how to mitigate this. Sometimes you have to realize as a bodybuilder, you're assuming some risk. You can't always have your cake and eat it. Sometimes there's scenarios where you're going to be understanding I'm balancing a risk with my health for the effect of getting a look that I want to be competitive on the stage. But there is ways to mitigate it so you can get that scale from being tipped so far one way to a little bit more of a reasonable effect. So one thing we can do is supporting our parasympathetic system in the sense of getting us into a more restful mindset, in a restful state. One thing that's I'm a fan of is ashwagandha, maybe at I would suggest it varies in range, but anything for 300 milligrams up to a gram a day can definitely help with not just your calming sympathetic activity, but also kind of mood. That does help me relieve a little bit of tension, make me not want to strangle people sometimes. I feel ashwagandha definitely helps with that. L-theanine at 200 to 400 milligrams can also help that parasympathetic system become more balanced and again tip that scale. Some people believe in this, but I've never really used it. I'm sure it does work, but breath work, taking times to be more meditative, can actually help at least immediately bring down the heart rate. So those are a couple things that are going to help at least parasympathetic system, getting you out of that fight and flight mode and more into a recovery mode, which should hopefully bring that heart rate down. Natural heart rate support. So what can we do to support the heart? Magnesium glycinate is something that definitely can help that as well. Looking at a minimum dose of 300 to 400 milligrams. I have myself personally up to 600 milligrams before bed. And that also helps with other issues. It does help with like bowel movement in the morning, it does help with a little bit of alleviating water retention, helps with some sleep quality as well. Those are some things that I would suggest. But get yourself a quality magnesium glycinate, and that's going to help as a electrolyte, also help with water retention, so you're not adding to elevated blood pressure, which can also lead to a higher heart rate or a call for your heart to have a higher heart rate. Taurine's another one which helps with electrolyte balance. One I'm not very familiar with, but came suggested very commonly, was hawthorn berry. That I don't have a dosage with, but I do have some clients that use that for heart health as well. Another one that would help immediately bring down that heart rate would be a beta blocker itself. So that's a medication that you can work with that will help with raised heart rate. Your doctor can probably prescribe that. You can probably source yourself, which I do myself. I personally take 5 milligrams a day. I've always had a higher heart rate anyhow. I find myself an edgy person, very active, but I do find every time I check my blood pressure stays in line. I do a lot of things to keep my blood pressure manageable and within a good range, but I do see my heart rate tend to be elevated, and Abivitol at 5 milligrams is all that it takes for myself to bring that to cause that beta blocker to lower my heart rate. And it does help when you're running something. I believe when you run something like clenbuterol, which also acts upon the beta 2 receptor, that beta blocker can at least help alleviate the heart rate increase that you get from the clenbuterol, making it not as rough as a compound when using it. So giving your heart a little bit more help. I'd consider that, especially if you're in 85 plus BPM. And then the other thing that we can look at into, just again, is worth reiterating, is auditing your stack. If your heart rate's elevated, don't just blame the GLP-1 itself as much as the whole fat burning plan that you have in place. Look at, am I using clenbuterol again, yohimbine, T3, tren, a ton of caffeine. A lot of us bodybuilders live off of caffeine pre-work morning, pre-cardio, staying up to get work done, or powering through their work days, because a lot of us obviously have full-time jobs while we're bodybuilding as well. So I think auditing your entire stack is important to look at too. Look at the big picture. Don't just become hyper focused on one introduction of one drug. You might find yourself getting better effects just from using retatrutide itself in eliminating some of these ECY stacks or some of these stimulatory fat burning protocols. So you might actually find out less is more in just using one product that works best for you rather than 5 combined that's doing one effect for like fasted cardio to burn fat. You might find yourself actually just getting better effects and having better rest and recovery from just the GLP, or the other way around. Maybe the GLP is not worth it for you, not working for you, not your thing. You get negative feedback and side effects, and you just like the old school ECY stacks, which still work great. Now, this is mixed feedback I get, is that will it go away? Will your body come back to a homeostatic point where it balances out the heart rate itself? I asked my buddy Chase Irons, because I know he has been using these GLP-1s from Tirzepatide to retatrutide, not just retatrutide itself, but a couple of these GLP-1s and multifaceted ones. And he's used them over a sustained amount of time to give me a little bit of feedback if heart rate comes down on its own and your body becomes adaptive and levels off itself. He says it does. He says that he's experienced it, especially when implementing cardio, that it's become helpful for his heart to actually get that heart rate to come back down, which I would suggest too, something we can add to that list here of how to fix and lower the elevated heart rate is cardiovascular health itself. If you have poor cardiovascular health, I can imagine you're going to have issues with elevated heart rate anyhow. But he seems to believe that maybe in the 20 to 30-week range, you start seeing things leveling off. I've had a few people mention even less than that, like the 12 to 16-week range. I've never used it more than 3, 4 months myself and had other things in play. So I couldn't really pinpoint if I was able to get the effects of elevated heart rate from retatrutide to come down on its own. I had too much mixing around to give a fair assessment of that. But from what people are telling me, that with just retatrutide or GLP-1s itself, they will stabilize to some degree on its own when the body becomes a little bit more adapted. This can also happen faster when your body's not stacking a lot of these stimulants. When you don't have a lot of these other things in play, PEDs on top and stimulants on top, your body's going to quickly adapt a little bit faster. I can imagine so. I see that being true. So, with that all being said, a checklist of things that we can think of to keep in mind if we're going to utilize GLP-1s as a bodybuilder. How can we think ahead? How can we mitigate any effects while using them? And is it even worth it in the long run? Personally, I think that some of these GLP-1s are definitely a tool. I think of Coach Paul in the back of my head, Coach Paul Barnett, anabolic bodybuilding, saying that everything is a tool. You just need to utilize them at the right times and responsibly, and you'll get the effects you want and know when to push them and to use, pull them. You don't bring a hammer for when you need a screwdriver. You bring the right tool for the right scenario. And I think that there's definitely a use for these post-show for a rebound effect to help appetite, as well as just helping you get in shape in general. We've also seen effects with some of these GLP-1s that have the glucagon effect in them. We've noticed that those have helped fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease become fixed over time. I think it was something like 80% of people that had signs of what was it, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease came into a normal range. About 80% of these people in about 12 weeks, or I could be off, but at some point in time, they did start seeing about 80% of people fixing fatty liver disease just from the implementation of, I'd imagine, the glucagon in some of these multifaceted GLP-1s. So what's our checklist? So we want to look at tracking, just like we would track our heart rate. We can track our blood pressure, track our glucose. We can track our weight. We can track a lot of different things as bodybuilders. We can track our heart rate. My blood pressure cuff tracks my heart rate. So I'm getting, every time I get my blood pressure, I'm getting my heart rate. You can use like your Oura Ring, a smartwatch, an app. All those things are definitely useful. The other thing we can consider into that checklist is these adaptogens that can help the effects that we get from the sympathetic system. So, like the ashwagandha, the L-theanine, and taurine, and balance, helping keeping our electrolytes in balance as well, are all these things that can keep our sympathetic state in a little bit of a better running state. Especially the ashwagandha, I think, is quite useful. It's quite a nice multifaceted tool. We can support our cardiovascular system with some things like magnesium, the beta blocker we mentioned, the Bivitol. We can also take a look at our stack itself. Again, reiterating, do we need 5 different fat burners in play to get in shape when we have a diet, we have a training, we have a cardio, we might have a GLP-1 in place? Do we need to use Clen and Yohimbine and ephedrine and T3 and metabolism boosters like the thyroid medications? Maybe we don't need 5 different fat burners, but just 1 or 2 strategic tools like the GLP-1, or we don't need the GLP-1. We just use a couple stimulants and keep our heart rate in range. Always looking at lifestyle is another part of our checklist we need to think of. Cardio. You should have cardio where you're challenging the heart at a 120 to 140 beats per minute heart rate at least 3, 4 times a week. Maybe let's say 20 to 30 minutes. It depends on the scenario. But for at least basic heart health, you should get 20, 25 minutes. A big believer, at least 3 times a week. And it can be steady state, doesn't have to be HIIT cardio. But having that lifestyle of good diet, good cardiovascular health, all plays into a healthier heart to start, which can manage and withstand these GLPs and peptides a little better anyhow. And that's just going to help you build a better long term heart rate in general. And then just consider that you're going into this understanding that there is going to be an elevated heart rate. So let's give it some time, see if it normalizes. If it doesn't normalize, then you start using these tools to mitigate those effects. All in all, I think that they're useful. I think it's just like anything else, there's side effects. I think you need to understand how those side effects come about, how the drug works itself in the body, what's your outcome, managing your expectation with these tools. And GLP-1s are just a tool like anything else in bodybuilding. If used correctly, they can be very efficient and incredible and work very well. And then, just like in bodybuilding, having too many tools in place, too many compounds can be detrimental if we have too big of a stack, too much going on where the body just can't handle that. We all feel like Superman, but we're not. So, nonetheless, I hope this helped you at least understand how we get an elevated heart rate from these GLP-1s, how we can mitigate some of those effects, how we can use these tools responsibly. I do think you should consider also one thing I didn't mention was cycling these on and off. I think people become too reliant all the time on thinking they have to be on these GLP-1s and find themselves using them chronically all the time. I don't think that's the case. I think you should consider using them, and then when you don't need them, you don't take them and you back off responsibly. But nonetheless, hopefully I can bring you more of my thoughts here and there on some of these compounds that people are experimenting with down the road. Hope to keep contributing some of these videos and to see if I can help anybody use them and use them correctly, or at least understand them. And I'm still learning myself. I don't know everything about them, but I am certainly intrigued. But give me a subscribe, drop me a comment, let me know what you guys think, what's your experience with them. Yeah, love to hear from you. Any engagement is going to just help the channel and help support me. So nonetheless, I hope that was helpful to you guys. And until the next one, be good, everybody.